Judge laughs at black teenager in court, shocked when his exposes the truth about himself. They didn't expect him to last 5 minutes in that courtroom. A young black man, no lawyer, no allies, standing alone against a system built to watch him fall. But what no one saw coming, not even the judge, was how Zane Jacobs would turn their entire narrative upside down. This isn't a story about the law. It's a story about survival, silence, and the moment one voice becomes impossible to ignore. Stay with this one, because by the end, you won't just be watching his fight. You might realize it's your fight too. They didn't know who he was when he entered that courtroom, and truthfully, they didn't care. To them, he was just another name on the docket, another face that matched too many statistics, another black man in a place where black men were rarely heard, only judged. Zane Jacobs, 25, walked in alone. No legal team, no briefcase, not even a tie. Just a plain blazer over a hoodie and an old pair of shoes that still carried the dust of someone who worked late nights, not someone preparing to defend himself in a courtroom. He moved with a quiet confidence that could easily be mistaken for arrogance if you weren't paying attention. But no one in that room was. Not really. They saw the surface, and that was enough. The bailiff didn't make eye contact. The reporter in the back row didn't even look up from her phone. And the judge, Honorable Whitmore, exhaled slowly when he saw Zane step forward. "You're Zane Jacobs?" the judge asked, eyes already tired. "Yes, Your Honor," Zane replied. "And I see you've waived counsel." Zane gave a slight nod. "Correct." The judge leaned back, glancing toward the gallery with an expression halfway between disbelief and irritation. "You do realize the seriousness of this charge, Mr. Jacobs? This isn't traffic court. This is felony assault." From the back, someone scoffed. Another chuckled low. The kind of laughter people use to fill their silence when they're sure they already know the ending. Zane stood still. His throat was dry, but his voice didn't crack. "I understand, Your Honor. Do you also understand that representing yourself in this kind of hearing is unwise, to say the least?" Zane hesitated, just for a moment. Not because he doubted himself, but because he knew what came next mattered. Because this was the moment they expected him to fold. Apologize. Ask for mercy. Lower his gaze like every other man who'd stood where he stood. But he didn't. He raised his chin slightly, locking eyes with the judge. "With respect, sir, what's unwise is believing someone else can speak for me better than I can speak for myself." There was a pause. The judge's brow twitched. A soft murmur passed through the gallery. Someone leaned in. Someone else started writing again. Zane could feel them watching now. Not the way they had when he entered. Not as if he were a statistic, but as if he might be something more than that. Something they hadn't figured out yet. And that was precisely the point. He wasn't trying to prove them wrong. He was waiting for them to realize they had never been right. He had read the room long before he entered it. The smirks, the low murmurs, the cold arithmetic of suspicion weren't new. Zane Jacobs stood in the courtroom like a man who'd already survived it once before. He just hadn't been allowed to win last time. The district attorney was already on his feet, voice rich with authority and certainty. "Your Honor, this isn't complicated. The defendant was at the scene. The evidence ties him to the act. This is not a question of if. It's a question of accountability." The gallery nodded along, eager for resolution. They liked easy villains. Standing alone without counsel, wearing worn leather shoes and a weathered stare, Zane made it far too easy. But then he moved. He raised his hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough to interrupt the rhythm. "Objection," he said. The DA turned like he'd been slapped. "Excuse me?" Zane stepped forward, neither rushing nor hesitating. "You're assuming motive without evidentiary support. That makes it inadmissible under Rule 403. The courtroom shifted. That one sentence didn't just halt the narrative, it rewrote it. The judge adjusted his glasses. "You're quoting federal evidentiary law?" "Yes, Your Honor. And I'd like the record to reflect that the surveillance footage, Exhibit B, was acquired via an anonymous source with no chain of custody." The DA laughed, a dry, clipped sound. "This isn't a seminar, Mr. Jacobs." Zane didn't blink. "No, but if it were, you'd be failing it." The room froze. That was not what they expected. The defendant had teeth. But even as Zane stood tall, something was unraveling inside. His breath wasn't short, but the memory returned uninvited, sharp, metallic, and lodged in his ribs. He was 19 again, sitting in a cold basement interview room under flickering fluorescent lights. There was no lawyer, no questions, just accusations barked like commands. "You were there. You had to be. Just say it." The detective's voice was coated in exhaustion, but Zane remembered the silence louder than the shouting. He didn't speak, not because he was guilty, but because he'd already learned what speaking cost. He'd stayed quiet. They took that as a confession. Years later, in this courtroom, he spoke not to defend himself, but to unlearn his silence. The judge cleared his throat. "Do you have anything to support your claims?" Zane reached into his folder, pulled out a document. Forensic metadata analysis. It shows that the timestamp on the footage was altered after capture. I've highlighted the inconsistencies. The bailiff took the papers. The judge scanned the first page. His face didn't change, but his pause before speaking said enough. And then, Zane did the unthinkable. He walked toward the jury box. "Your Honor," he said, still calm and poised. "I know this isn't standard procedure, but may I address the court directly?" The judge hesitated. So did everyone else. Zane turned to the 12 faces watching him, strangers with the power to shape his future. "You don't know me," he said, "but you think you do because I look like someone who's been here before, someone who makes the world nervous, someone who fits." He paused, not for effect, but because the following words were heavier than he'd prepared for. "I've spent more time learning the law than ever breaking it. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because no one else was going to learn it for me. When the world assumes you're guilty before you speak, your only defense is knowing more than they expect." His voice never rose. He didn't perform, but he pulled the entire room into stillness. "This isn't just about me. It's about how easy it is to build a case on broken pieces and present it as a whole, and how quickly people nod if the face behind the accusation looks familiar enough." No one moved. The DA looked stunned. The judge said nothing. For a moment, Zane didn't feel like the defendant anymore. He felt like the only person telling the truth. He returned to his table, sat down slowly, and waited. Not for pity, not for applause. It was just for anyone to admit they hadn't seen him coming. Zane wasn't supposed to win. That truth lived in the eyes of every person watching him, masked behind civility, hidden in court-approved language, but there nonetheless. They weren't here for justice. They were here for confirmation. And for a moment, Zane feared they were about to get it. The judge's voice echoed with authority and finality. "The court will now review the prosecution's new submission. An audio recording recovered last night from a witness claiming to have heard the defendant admit to the crime. Zane's hands tightened on the table. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't confessed anything. His preparation had been meticulous, airtight. So, where was this coming from? The DA handed the flash drive to the clerk. Your Honor, this clip, just under 30 seconds, demonstrates the defendant's consciousness of guilt. The courtroom dimmed as the audio began to play. A voice, a rustle, and then a sentence. I didn't mean to hurt him, but he had it coming. It was Zane's voice, or something eerily close to it. Same cadence, same tone. For a full 3 seconds, the room held its breath. Zane froze. The air left his lungs, not just because of the recording, but because he recognized the sentence. Not as something he'd said about this case, but from a podcast interview he had given nearly 2 years ago about a completely different moment in his life. A fight in high school, a moment of regret. They'd sliced it and twisted it, turned it into a weapon. He looked up. The DA was watching him like a man already planning the press conference. Zane opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in the trial, he looked uncertain. Not weak, but cornered. And everyone could feel it. His eyes searched the room for anything but found only silence and waiting judgment. The judge was already shifting, leaning toward a ruling. The jury had stiffened. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Zane's throat tightened. He swallowed. Then he did something rare for him. He hesitated. He could feel his composure slipping, like sand between his fingers. And beneath it all, the fury began to rise. Not the righteous kind, but the helpless kind. The kind that made you want to scream, because the system didn't just bend the rules, it rewrote them mid-game. He was losing, and they could feel it. Until one small voice cracked through the fog in his memory. His brother's voice, years ago, at a juvenile hearing where Zane had stood behind him and watched the court erase him in real time. You don't fight fire with fire, Z. You wait, you breathe, then you flip the whole damn map. Zane inhaled. Once, twice, then stood. Your Honor, he said, calm but not cold. I recognize that audio. It's mine, but not from this case. It's from a podcast I did 2 years ago, in which I was speaking about an unrelated high school incident. I have the full recording saved. The words have been deliberately edited out of context to imply confession. The judge blinked. Zane walked to his folder, pulled out a printout with a QR code. This links to the original time-stamped episode on the podcast platform. Uncut. Public. Available long before this trial. The clerk took it, played the whole clip. Same voice, same words, but now with context. Laughter in the background. A host's voice followed. That sounds like high school drama, man. The courtroom shifted again. Zane didn't look angry anymore. He looked clear. He turned to the jury. You've just heard how easy it is to take a sentence, a sound bite, and build a story that fits a desired truth. Not the real one, but one that's useful. One that sells. That wins. He looked directly at the DA. You didn't find the truth. You crafted a headline. Then he faced the judge. And that's the danger, Your Honor. When pursuing justice becomes a performance, the truth becomes a casualty. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. The judge finally leaned forward, voice slow. The court finds that the audio clip was, in fact, misleading. It will be struck from the record. Zane nodded once, sat down. The DA fumed silently, but Zane wasn't watching him anymore. He wasn't watching anyone. He was breathing, because this time he hadn't just defended himself. He'd revealed the system's hand and survived it, for now. And yet, in the way the gallery watched him now, not like a defendant, but like something much more challenging to control, he knew they weren't afraid of his guilt. They were afraid of how close he was getting to the truth. Judge Whitmore hadn't always been this way. There was a time, long ago, when he believed the courtroom was a cathedral of truth, that justice, though flawed, was reachable. But over the years, something changed. It wasn't one moment, but 1,000 small ones. Fabricated witness statements that no one questioned. Young men were brought in on charges that didn't match their faces or futures. Quiet settlements, overturned verdicts, the slow erosion of trust, case by case, until truth started to feel like a dangerous luxury, one that could cost him everything if mishandled. And then came Zane Jacobs. At first, Whitmore saw what he had trained himself to see, a risk wrapped in self-representation, carrying the misplaced confidence of someone who didn't understand the stakes. But something about Zane disturbed that pattern. The boy didn't crack. Not when he was mocked. Not when they threw doctored evidence at him. Not even when he looked like he might lose. Now, Whitmore couldn't look away. Not because Zane was winning, though he was, but because Zane was exposing a system the judge had spent years trying not to look too closely at. And that terrified him. It wasn't that he wanted Zane to fail. If Zane succeeded, the rules of this place, the unspoken agreements between those in robes and those in suits, might not hold anymore. Zane wasn't just defending himself. He was rewriting the narrative mid-trial. And Whitmore wasn't sure he was ready to live in that kind of courtroom. The prosecutor, Franklin, felt the same way. He was younger, sharper in appearance than the judge, and hungrier. But under his polished opening statements and curated evidence was a fear he couldn't shake. He had built his career on controlling the story, the flow, and the optics. And Zane had disrupted all three. Franklin wasn't afraid of Zane's mind. He was scared of what Zane represented, because Franklin had worked too hard, lost too much, and swallowed too many compromises to admit now that the very system that lifted him was rigged in his favor. If he let Zane win, what did that say about the cases he'd prosecuted before this? About the men who hadn't had the education, the voice, the poise? What did it say about the ones who had begged and were ignored? He hated Zane, not for what he did, but for how he saw. But hatred is rarely clean. Sometimes it masks something quieter. Envy. Zane stood in the courtroom and commanded space in a way Franklin had never mastered. He didn't use volume or theatrics. He used the truth. Sharp, dangerous, disarming truth. And Franklin had the sinking feeling that no matter what evidence he threw, Zane would find the cracks, force them open, and turn them into a mirror. That made Franklin afraid. So when he walked back to his table after the judge struck the falsified audio from the record, his hands trembled slightly. Zane noticed. The entire room had shifted. The jury was no longer casually observant. They were watching every breath, every glance, every break in rhythm. Zane had become something more than a defendant. He had become the person everyone was calibrating themselves against. And Whitmore was starting to listen like he hadn't before. "Mr. Jacobs," the judge said, breaking the silence, "I must admit, I've never seen a self-represented defendant operate at this level. You've made compelling arguments. However, understand that the burden of proof still lies with you. Do you have a defense prepared?" Zane looked up, steady. "I don't have a defense," he said. "I have a reality, and I'm not asking this court to accept my word over evidence. I'm asking this court to question which evidence gets believed, and why, finally." A murmur moved through the room like wind. Franklin stood abruptly, trying to regain ground. "Your Honor, the defense is making philosophical claims. This is a court of law, not a lecture hall." Zane turned to him, not angry, not smug, just clear. "You're right. It's a court of law. Let's discuss the law. Let's talk about Brady violations, when the prosecution withholds evidence that could clear the accused. Let's talk about the missing body cam footage from the responding officer, which was mysteriously redacted. And let's talk about how I only received the full discovery packet 2 days ago. Barely enough time for a real defense." Franklin paled. Zane turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a formal motion to suppress all prosecution materials filed after the discovery deadline. This trial is no longer about guilt or innocence. It's about whether the truth has a fighting chance in a room built to bury it." The judge stared at him, silent, not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't sure he could keep pretending that he did. The courtroom wasn't a room anymore. It had become a spotlight, and everyone in it, Franklin, Whitmore, the bailiff, even the jury, was now forced to examine Zane and themselves. Not one of them knew how this would end, but for the first time, they feared they could no longer control that outcome. And that, more than any argument or objection, was the most potent thing Zane Jacobs had done yet. He made the room afraid, but not of him, of the truth. The verdict didn't come with fireworks, no gasp, no standing ovation, just the low, measured voice of Judge Whitmore, who cleared his throat once and looked at Zane with a gaze that no longer carried superiority, just weight. "Given the irregularities in the prosecution's conduct, the unreliable evidence submitted, and the defendant's right to a fair trial," he said, his voice slower now, more deliberate, "the court hereby rules in favor of the defendant. Mr. Zane Jacobs, you are free to go." The room didn't move for a moment. Zane didn't exhale, not yet. Even victory, when earned under the gaze of those who wanted you caged, doesn't feel like release. It feels like survival, dressed up as justice. He nodded once. No smile, no relief. Just a subtle return to breath. The DA stared at the desk in front of him, papers untouched. For all his performance, all his precision, he hadn't expected this ending. Not from someone like Zane. And Whitmore, who had once looked at Zane like a disruption, now looked at him like a question he couldn't quite answer. Zane walked out of the courtroom not as a man who had won, but as a man who had endured. Outside, the air was heavy with rain that hadn't fallen yet. Reporters circled like birds sensing blood, cameras already lifted, mics already pointed. "Zane, any comment on the verdict? Do you feel vindicated? Are you planning to press misconduct charges?" He said nothing. It wasn't that he didn't have something to say. He just didn't want to give it to them. Not like this. Not yet. He moved past them and down the courthouse steps, where a woman stood waiting. Gray hoodie, arms folded, eyes that had seen too much grief to waste time pretending. His mother. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not because of anger, but because they didn't know what words could carry the weight of what was happening. She stood there, still as stone, until he stepped before her. She looked him over, not for bruises, but for cracks. "I watched," she said. Zane's jaw tightened. "I know. They tried to break you." He didn't answer. They almost did. That too, he couldn't answer. But then her voice dropped lower, softer, and still. You stood. Zane looked at her, eyes finally softening. Only because you did first. She pulled him in then, no dramatic sobs, just the hard embrace of a mother who had prayed too many nights for moments like this. For a while they said nothing, just breath and bone and the knowledge that truth doesn't always win, but sometimes, if it's loud enough, sharp enough, stubborn enough, it survives. They began to walk past the steps and cameras toward the edge of the courthouse plaza. That's when a voice called out, "Mr. Jacobs?" Zane turned. A boy stood there, no more than 16, tall, thin, eyes too tired for his age. His hoodie bore the name of a high school Zane remembered from headlines, disciplinary scandals, arrests, kids suspended over petty infractions. The boy stepped closer, hesitant but determined. "I just wanted to say—" He paused, then tried again. "When you spoke today, when you stood up and said what you said, it felt like someone finally said it for people like me." Zane didn't respond right away. He studied the kid, not to assess him, but to recognize him. He saw how the boy's shoulders hunched, like they'd been trained to shrink. He saw how his hands stayed visible, like someone had taught him never to give the world a reason to assume the worst. He saw himself, just a few years earlier. The boy cleared his throat. "Do you ever talk to people about this stuff? Like, if I had questions?" Zane glanced at his mother. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that pushed him toward duty. The kind that reminded him why he couldn't afford not to answer. He looked back at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "I do." The boy nodded, eyes brighter now. "Cool, thanks." He walked away, and Zane stood there, the silence no longer heavy, but full. Full of things unspoken, of things just beginning. His mother touched his arm. "That's how it starts," she whispered. "You changed something in that room today. But what matters is what you do with it outside of it." Zane looked up at the gray sky, still waiting to fall. Then he smiled, not the kind you give to a camera, but the kind that rises from somewhere bone deep. The kind that comes not from relief, but resolve. Justice hadn't saved him. He had dragged it to the light, inch by inch. And now, someone else was watching. Maybe that was the real verdict. Zane's story reminds us that truth doesn't always walk through the front door. It often has to fight its way in. Sometimes justice isn't granted. It's demanded and carved out by those brave enough to stand when everything tells them to sit down. What Zane did wasn't just about winning a case. It was about breaking the silence, shifting perception, and planting courage in the hearts of those watching. If his voice made you pause or echoed something you felt, feared, or faced, we invite you to share your perspective in the comments. How did this story move you? What would you have done in his place? Your voice matters. And if stories like this speak to you, stories of courage, justice, and change, like and subscribe to our channel now for more interesting stories.